I'm going to do that now with your all's permission. Okay, we're recording. So from now on, don't say anything that you don't want to be used against you. Hello and welcome, and good to see you all again. I've got my screen died last week, so I've got a brand new screen to my left. So I'll apologize ahead of time that if I have some logistical, I'll ask your patience if I have some logistical difficulties, because I'm getting used to a new screen up there that hasn't talked to this laptop quite this way before. So, but welcome and welcome back. We are doing a four-part series on Christmas in the Gospels, which is a little bit of a misnomer because, as many of you know, the stories that we associate with Christmas are really only found in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. John and Mark have no infancy or birth narratives, no stories of Jesus before Jesus is a full-grown adult. But we still are looking at all four of the Gospels because all four of the Gospels still tell a story about how God came to earth and revealed God's self on earth in the person of Jesus, even if they don't necessarily tell the birth stories that we associate with Christmas itself. So last week we looked at Matthew, and I'm going to just do a very, very, very brief recap of last week in case there's any of you who weren't there, and then take a little bit of time for conversation and questions before diving in to Mark. And because today we want to take a little bit closer look at the Gospel of Mark. So let me go ahead and screen share and put this up. Boom. Assume you're looking at a screen that mostly, let me do two things here to make it easier on you all. Darn it. I'm glad I apologized ahead of time for these logistical difficulties. Okay, let me see. Tell me if that is better for you all. Did that get better, what I just did?
The first one was the full screen. Now you've got your top control bar showing. There you go.
That look better?
Yes.
Okay, good, just as well. Again, looking at Christmas in the Gospels according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The context in which we're doing that here is to have Advent be a season of joyful anticipation of Christmas. And as I said last week, each of those words is important. Advent's a season of anticipation. It's a season of looking forward. It's not a season of prematurely celebrating Christmas. But the lessons that we are hearing in church on Sunday with the bishop's permission are not the lessons from the Revised Common Lectionary or the Book of Common Prayer. They are more or less the gospel lessons from each of the 3 Sundays in Advent, the 4th Sunday of Advent in each of the 3 years. So what I've done is taken that 4th Sunday of Advent gospel and divided them up into all the Sundays of Advent. And the reason for that is that those lessons, those gospels, anticipate Christmas. They point towards Christmas. They tell the story of the first coming, if you will, as opposed to stories of the second coming or the apocalypse, the way that the lectionary does. And so it's an anticipation of it's anticipation, but not celebration. It's an anticipation of Christmas, and it's joyful anticipation because the news that is delivered to us, the news that's delivered to humanity, is good news of great joy. Good tidings of great joy is how Jesus's arrival on earth is announced. So that's by way of a very general overview of this particular class. Again, by way of overview, the Christmas story is about how God's own son, God's self, came into the world, but each gospel tells that story a little bit differently. We talked a little bit about the synoptic problem last week. Synoptic just means to take a common view, and I want to remind those of you who were here last week, or bring you up to speed if you weren't here last week, that that the gospels, the gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered the synoptic gospels because they more or less take the same common view. Synoptic means to take a common view. And these three gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke more or less follow the same chronology. And John is sort of out there on John's own with a very different chronology and a very different way of telling the story of Jesus. No less or more valuable, but different. Different in structure, different in chronology, and so on. So that's by way of catching us all up on last week. And let me pause there before diving into Mark, just to see what comments or questions or thoughts that you all have, to invite a little bit of conversation around what you've heard so far. Anybody? Come on, someone ask a question. It gives me a chance to take a sip of coffee. Carol, you're on mute. Did you ask to did you want to say something? Okay. Anybody? So you ready to dive in? Mm-hmm. Okay, let's dive in. Let's dive in. The way that for centuries, biblical scholars, for centuries, really from shortly after the time of Jesus, up until the 1900s, think about that. For 19 centuries, biblical scholars, insofar as there were biblical scholars, people who studied the Bible, used to assume that what the Gospel of Mark was, what I've got here is a photo of a reduction sauce. And that's my own analogy or metaphor for what scholars used to think the Gospel of Mark was. For 19 centuries, most scholars assumed that what the Gospel of Mark, what we were seeing in the Gospel of Mark, was a boiled down version of Matthew and Mark, and Matthew and Luke, and to some degree John. That Mark was familiar with those other Gospels and thought there was a lot of falderall or unnecessary detail in there, and basically just boiled it and boiled it and boiled it and boiled it and boiled it down until you get the richest, thickest, most flavorful concoction that you could come up with. That's how most people thought of the Gospel of Mark, that it was a condensed version of those other Gospels. But in the 1900s, biblical scholarship made leaps and bounds in its research. And I would say that now, if to use that same metaphor, now Mark's assumed role in the synoptics for most of the 20th century, since the 1900s, is that Mark provides the ingredients for Matthew and for Luke. That Matthew and Luke drew upon Mark. It's not that Mark condensed what Mark was looking at, but rather that Matthew and Luke took the ingredients of Mark and embellished. You see the difference?
Yeah.
So it's the exact opposite conclusion that arrives at the same flavorful stories, but basically what the theory is now is that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a primary source, not as their only source, because again, as we looked at that last week, now the theory is, again, since the 1900s, theory is that Matthew drew upon Mark and that Luke drew upon Mark, and that both Matthew and Luke drew upon another source that is lost, unknown, and that source is called Q, simply because the German word for source begins with the letter Q. No further mystery to that. So So when we look at Mark now, there's another possible way. This is another analogy I came up with, or metaphor. I think this might be one way to think about the Gospels. It's overly simplistic, but just a way to sort of get going or hang your head, a peg to hang some further thoughts on. This is another possible way of looking at it. What if this were the Gospel of Mark, and this is the Gospel of Matthew, and this was the Gospel of Luke, Acts, because as you may know, Luke and Acts were written by the same person and they tell the same story. They just happen to be divided up in most of our Bibles by the Gospel of John. But really, Luke, Acts is one book in two parts, and this being the Gospel of John. What I love about this is all this chaotic mess over here from which they drew it, and yet there's a line, there's a thread, there's a story that's told that's pulled out of that. And that story is, if you were to really play this out, I can't find the illustrations for it, each of these would be knit together in yet a new story as we consider and play with and tease out and build and knit our own life story together with the story that's told. And this mess over here would be Jesus's life and all the oral tradition that went on for a very long time before any of these Gospels began to be written. So that's another sort of way of thinking about it, is they all have their origin in the same messy place. They all tell stories in different ways, but they're all connected back to the same overall arching story. So what about the Gospel according to Mark? Who was Mark? That's a question, again, that people really haven't been curious about until relatively very recently in world history. The simple answer is we don't know who Mark was. Most of the authors in antiquity didn't really care about authorship the way that we do. They didn't care about assigning credit or blame to what was written. And so there's theories that there are marks mentioned in scripture. It's not really clear if the John called Mark in Acts is the same Mark, who's a cousin of Barnabas, named in Colossians. That's been the tradition. There's been another tradition out there that that Mark was an interpreter for Peter. What we can know with some certainty, even though we don't know who the person was, we can know that the author of Mark was primarily a Greek speaker and almost certainly not an eyewitness to the events of the gospel. Why? When? It has to do with when Mark was. Mark was the earliest gospel, but it's still probably written in the late 60s or early 70s. So we're talking 60 to 70 years after the birth of Jesus. And who was Mark's audience? That people know a little bit more. Biblical scholars surmise that Mark's audience probably were Greek speakers who didn't know a lot of Aramaic, just the way that Mark sometimes has to explain Aramaic phrases in ways that he doesn't explain Greek phrases. They probably were probably not a primarily Jewish audience because they needed certain Jewish customs explained. They do know certain Jewish terms just because they're living in the culture. And one of the things we know is that they were eagerly anticipating the second coming and that coming very soon. Mark's not really writing to convert people. He's writing to the converted. And think about that for a minute. If Mickey or Miranda or Kim or anybody else in the formation side of things was putting together a lesson plan, think about that and let's talk about that. How would you write a lesson plan differently if your class A were already Christians and class B were people who were not, who hadn't heard of this thing called Christianity, but were curious about it? How would you write the story differently? Let's say, Mickey, give you a pop quiz. Pick a story, any story. How would you tell that differently to a class full of people who were already Christians versus a class full of people who had never heard about Christianity?
Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
I think that what Mark did, and probably what I do in the atrium, and I don't know that I differentiate too much between those who are considered Christian and those who are not, because I kind of look at everybody as a seeker, and where they are on the journey is ever changing. But the thing that Mark, my understanding, and probably what I would say I agree with is that Mark was really trying to make that connection, to look at this kind of the divine action of God, looking back at Old Testament prophecies and being able to make that connection. So I think so I would say that the direct aim of the lesson in a way is a lesson of hope. There is joy, but there's that sense of rejoice, do not be afraid, rejoice, God is near. But Mark shows that God has been in this action of salvation all along. You're muted, I think. You're muted. John.
Miranda, can I give you a pop quiz?
You can give it a shot. We'll see how it goes.
You've got two groups of high school juniors. One group of high school juniors grew up at All Souls, went through all of the catechesis of the Good Shepherd, know the stories, know the history, know what church is, been to church. You got another group of high schoolers who, for some reason, let's say they moved here from some godforsaken place like Northern Virginia, and they've never even heard of this thing called Christianity. How would you tell the story of the feeding of the 5,000 any differently to those two groups?
There might be some places that there could be more of a shortcut, less definition, and kind of explanation or kind of background information between the two groups. But I think because of how I teach, how I think knowledge should be shared, and because of kind of where I am in my journey around Christianity as well, for both groups, it wouldn't be kind of taken for granted that we know what's in those stories for either of them. Some of them maybe think they know or have familiarity with those stories, but I think in any moment, every year, as you go around the sun, every time that you have more experiences, what is in those stories for you changes, and what is in those stories for your community changes. I mean, looking at 2020 versus past years, there is so much more for me in Advent than there has been in past years. There's so much more thinking about how maybe we're called to sit in the darkness versus just focusing on the light at the end of the tunnel, how it can be a place for reflection and curiosity. So yeah, that's a long way of saying, yes, maybe there are some shortcuts around around definitions or what the words are that could happen. But I think it would be important for me to approach both of those stories with both groups with just a lot of curiosity.
So now that since I'm doing pop quizzes, Michael or anybody else who's an EFM mentor, you've probably run into this, haven't you? Jean, yeah, go ahead, please.
I'm not a mentor, but I have a different answer.
Please.
And it might not be correct, but it seems to me that if I were in that position, the two positions you mentioned, if I were talking to people who'd already heard a lot of these stories, I would be approaching it like a journalist. I would be giving a summary, just the facts. This happened and this happened and that happened. And this is when that happened and this is when this happened. Not a lot of the why and the how. And that's just my impression and a reason for Mark's brevity, maybe. And whereas if I were speaking to people who had never heard most of the stories, I would want to fill in details and background and more of the atmosphere and why they were hungry and all the things they were hungry for. Anyway, that's my long answer.
Thank you.
John, I think.
Michael, you could jump in. Sorry, I'll get after Michael. Mickey, please.
John, your timing's perfect on this because those of us in EFM just finished Mark, so I have a chance to sound smart for a change. Along the same lines that Jean said, it felt to me like Mark was almost a kind of a greatest hits of Jesus's life, and as if because it was written for people who already knew the story, it was an attempt to put it all down so that it wasn't forgotten, like you collecting the stories, and it was very episodic, one after the other. This happened, then this happened, and this happened, focusing a lot on miracles and on teaching and that sort of thing. And it was almost like it all was just a lead up to the passion and crucifixion.
Thank you. Mickey.
Yeah, Mark knew exactly where Jesus was going and was trying to tell that story. For introducing this, I guess a little bit of clarity here is that the first thing, and probably one of the reasons why I love the infancy stories in Luke so much, is there's a real falling in love in Luke. You know, that there's that opportunity and invitation to fall in love with God. And Mark is telling a story, and this is what you do, you know, with anyone, I guess, who has already heard the stories, is you begin to synthesize those stories now. So where is a common thread? What do we already know about Jesus? What does this say now about when we've heard this story and we've heard this story? So we're putting things together about Jesus. And as I say, you know, looking back even further into the prophecies to see this common thread that God has been enacting throughout human history.
Others? Anybody else want to jump in before before I keep going on diving a little bit deeper into Mark?
I just wonder, as a former trainer, we used to be cognizant of the fact that people learn differently, and some learn emotionally, some learn, you know, we just learn differently. And now what you're saying, it sounds like something for everyone. So if Mark doesn't do it for you, hold on, you've got Luke and the others. So, and in the infinite wisdom of the infinite one, maybe this was this taking into account, we receive things differently. And, you know, whether it's mailed to you, FedEx to you, or knock on the door, you still get it. And that just struck me when you're talking about that.
I think about this a lot, not necessarily with Christians versus people who are seekers, people who are already familiar with the Christian story versus people who are not, who are new. Although I think about that a lot. I also think about it a lot as someone who has served Episcopal churches because of all the insider language that we tend to have. You'll hear an announcement. The senior warden will be meeting with lay Eucharistic ministers in the vestibule following the postlude. You know, it's like, please translate that for us. A member of the governing board will be meeting with the people who give out communion Sunday by Sunday in the back of the church. You know, I mean, that's the difference. That's one of the differences, is how much language, how much common language can we assume that our listeners know, and how much translation has to happen. How much do you walk people along with some of those terms? The bottom line is, if you know that the vast majority of your people already know the story, you tell it differently, versus people coming from very different starting places.
I also, going back to, your example of, like 2 different groups, and I always try to think of these people as like really humans. And I think if you're looking at another group of people that don't share the same story, there has to be some listening involved, because you have to really identify with your audience. And so before you can reframe, the message you're trying to convey.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's look at some characteristics quickly. Mark's is the shortest gospel. If you ever accept the challenge to read a gospel in one seating, just sit down, open up a gospel and read it from start to finish, Mark's a pretty good one, because it is the shortest of them. So if you feel intimidated by that challenge to read a gospel in one seating, Mark's a pretty good one to start with. By the way, that is a fantastic exercise to do, because I think it'll change the way that you hear the stories. We tend to hear, it's as if most Episcopalians anyway, probably most Christians, have never seen the motion picture, but we've only seen the trailers, or maybe we've just seen some of the scenes from some of the trailers. But if you watch it from beginning to end, or if you read it from beginning to end in one seating, you come up with a fresh understanding of Jesus's life and ministry and death and resurrection. In the Gospel of Mark, it is there's a as I think Michael alluded to, there's a crisp, fast pace. The word that's translated into English as immediately, I think, is in the Gospel of Mark 47 times. It's in Luke only once, and it's in Matthew only 3 times, that word, immediately, and then immediately, and immediately. And Mark also begins a lot of sentences with a conjunction and, which I'm not sure your high school English teacher would have let you get away with, but Mark starts a lot of what we would consider sentences, because obviously it's hard to find the punctuation in some of the Greek, if it's there. He starts a lot of sentences with conjunctions, and that's meant to keep the story moving. Jesus speaks the least in Mark. You have the least amount of words in Mark from Jesus. There is what some people refer to as a messianic secret. I've read a couple things that have convinced me that a better phrase for the messianic secret is the messianic mystery. So what is the messianic mystery? Glad you asked. The messianic mystery is that often, as in this scene, when Jesus meets a leper who asks to be cured, and Jesus cures the leper, Jesus sternly warns him to say nothing to anyone. He goes out and talks all the more anyway, but Jesus is often in the Gospel of Mark, his identity is shrouded in mystery, and Jesus seems to want to keep it that way.
John,
Please.
which is such an interesting thing, because in the other Gospels, anytime God kind of breaks through, there's that go and tell message.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's like the angels are always, you know, get out there and share it everywhere else, except in Jesus himself, who wants to kind of hold on to time, I think. I don't know.
And there's a fascinating difference in the Gospel of Mark, is that for much of the first half of Mark, it's not that no one knows who he is. It's just that it's the disciples. We'll talk in a minute more about the disciples in the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, to give you a preview, in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples are particularly thick. They're particularly dense. They just don't get it. Which is kind of liberating in a wonderful way, I think, because I think we can identify with them that way. But what's interesting is that demons and the general audience seems to get who Jesus is better than his closest followers. Demons know who he is. They identify it. But then with the disciples, Jesus has this interesting relationship where he tells these stories that are shrouded in mystery, and people kind of scratch their heads and say, I'm not sure what you meant by that. He'll pull the disciples aside and explain some of these parables to them. It's not as if he's keeping the disciples in the dark deliberately, though. That's not what the messianic, that's why I think mystery is a better word than secret. It's not that he's keeping his identity from the disciples a secret in the Gospel of Mark. They're specifically called. He tells them the mystery of himself. He tells them he's the suffering one. And they hear this long internal monologue in chapter 13 on what his role is on earth. But at the same time, they just don't seem to pick it up. So why? Why do you think Mark did that? I think that the best answer is identification. I think it helps us identify with those disciples. He seems to be saying, this is a quote from scholar Luke Timothy Johnson, Mark seems to be saying, if you think you're an insider, you may not be. If you think you understand the mystery of the kingdom and even control it, watch out. It remains alive and fearful beyond your comprehension. If you think discipleship consists in power because the presence of God, beware. You are called to follow the one who suffered and died. Your discipleship is defined by his messiahship, that is in terms of obedience and service. So I think part of the reason maybe that Mark keeps his disciples a little bit bumbling and confused is so that we don't get cocky as modern day followers, that we can identify with these disciples who sort of, they were so close to him, but never really fully got it, and therefore shouldn't approach their ministry from places of asserting all kinds of obnoxious power or knowledge, because they themselves were the people with the log in their eye trying to remove a splinter from someone else's eye. So Christmas, what about Christmas, John? Christmas in the Gospel of Mark. How does Mark describe Jesus' origins? Well, we see right away at the very beginning of the gospel that this is not going to be a biography. There is no account of John the Baptist's origins or of Jesus' birth or childhood. Rather, this is how the Gospel of Mark starts. Jumps right in. And the word "the" isn't even there. Really the translation would be beginning the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as is written in the prophet Isaiah. There's the tie-in that Mickey alluded to, the prophetic fulfillment. Here's a messenger preparing the way, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness. John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins, and people from the whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem were going out to him and were baptized in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. John was clothed camel's hair with a leather belt around his waist. He ate locusts of wild honey, proclaiming the one who's more powerful than I is coming after me. I'm not worthy to stoop down and untie the thong of his sandals. I have baptized you with water. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth, was baptized by John. He was coming up out of the water, sees the heavens torn apart, the Spirit descending like a dove. A voice comes from heaven, you are my son, the beloved, with you I'm well pleased. And immediately the Spirit drove him into the wilderness. He's in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan. He's a wild beast. Angels waited on him. John was arrested. Jesus came to Galilee, proclaiming the good news. The time is fulfilled. Believe. He passed along the Sea of Galilee, sees the fishermen, calls them, goes a little further, sees John and Zebedee, who were in their boat, calls them Zebedee, and they followed him. You are read that deliberately rapidly because we are only 20 verses into the Gospel of John, and Jesus has been baptized, has been driven into the wilderness for 40 days, and has already called his disciples. By contrast, 20 verses into Jesus isn't even mentioned as a human being in the Gospel of John, isn't even mentioned as a human being in the Gospel of John until the 29th verse of the first chapter. And in Matthew and Luke, chapter 1, verse 20, Jesus isn't even born yet. So you see the contrast, you see the difference there? You've got in Mark, you've got this full-grown adult who's already been baptized, he's already been tested in the wilderness, he's already called his disciples by verse 20. So we're setting a very fast pace here. This is what I've never golfed in my life, but it's what they call a shotgun start, I guess. Those of you who are familiar with golf, as you have a big tournament, you put everybody on every hole all at once, and there's a starting gun, and everybody starts and does the whole course instead of waiting patiently to line up 1, 2, 3, 4. Everybody starts on a different hole and everybody goes at the same time. That's how Mark just kind of gets going, jumps right in. I want to do one thing and then have some conversation. If you'll indulge me, I want to nerd out over punctuation, because if we are going to talk about what does Mark have to say about Christmas, I just want, one of the ways to do that is if you'll nerd out with me over some punctuation here. In other words, hold on to your seats, folks, because how can the placement of a colon and quotation marks change the way we think about and celebrate Christmas? You were always wondering that, weren't you?
Well, and John, isn't this, I mean, this is looking at the story within the story in front of the story, and, you know, behind the story, because this is the author. I mean, the people who have compiled Bible who have given us punctuation.
Yes.
Not
right. Right.
Writers themselves.
But still, as we receive it, the Gospel of Mark, as we read it, as we receive this thing called the Gospel of Mark, what can that convey to us about Christmas in 2020? That's the question I'm asking, as the way we've received it. And how I want to look at that is with this right here. This is, if you pick up a New Revised Standard Version of, and I didn't take the time to see if other translations do this differently, but this is what most people are used to seeing, both in the Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version. This is what we read in Mark, first on the right. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, see, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way, semicolon. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Who Mark is quoting there is Isaiah. And in Isaiah, this is what it says. A voice cries out, quote, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. What's the difference? It's a big difference. In Mark wants to put John the Baptist out in the wilderness, and in the wilderness, eating locusts and wild honey, saying this phrase, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. So in Mark, the messenger is out in the wilderness saying, prepare the way of the Lord. but it's really kind of a twist or almost a misquotation of Isaiah, because what is being said in Isaiah is, in the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord.
Yeah.
That is the place, that is the location to prepare the way of the Lord. It is in the wilderness that we prepare the way of the Lord. And that is such a the reason that matters is such a consistent theme in Scripture. Every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain shall be made low, the lion will lie down with the lamb. There's wilderness is such an important part of the Judeo-Christian story, especially in Judaism. The wilderness, it is in the wilderness where God's way is prepared. And the reason I care so much about this, it doesn't make a, frankly, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference where John the Baptist would be standing or where he would be when he says, prepare the way of the Lord. The point from Isaiah is in the wilderness that the people of God are to prepare the way of the Lord. And the reason that matters is that the story that we anticipate, the story that we build up to for Christmas, unfortunately, our culture has made it gauzy and hallmarky. And we start to feel that if we don't have this sort of Norman Rockwell Christmas with perfectly behaved children and the perfect Christmas present under the tree, and there's a multi-billion-dollar industry dedicated to trying to convince us that if we just purchase the right present, that our relationships will be healed on Christmas morning as they open this gift and get this glow. Oh, we finally have done it. There's a multi-billion-dollar industry studying human psychology and manipulating this idea that that we can purchase our way into reconciliation, and that there is such a thing, for that matter, as perfection. And what the Bible is saying is, it is in the wilderness that God works. It is in the brokenness that God works. Jesus was not born in the Ritz-Carlton of his day. You know, there's no room in the inn. Jesus and Joseph and Mary were refugees shortly after his birth. They were on the move. Mary was confused, probably tired. So if our lives are messy and broken and confused at this time of year, we are in good company. And the biblical story of Christmas is our story. If we let the biblical story of Christmas be the story that we're hearing, and not it's the most wonderful time of the year, or the mythologies that our culture builds up around Christmas versus the stories that our scriptures give us. So that's what I wanted to say about that. And it starts, yes, with a bit of nerdy punctuation, but I think it's such an important point to point out that this is a consistent theme in Scripture, that this, as we heard in today's gospel from the Magnificat, the tyrant shall be no more. God is active, God is working, God is redeeming, and it's among the real messy stuff of life that God gets involved, not in some idealistic world.
John?
Yes, ma'am.
What you're saying, I think, is so important. It speaks to what Miranda was talking about, you know, Advent being such an important time for us to be able to perceive that darkness as a time of growth. And in Mark, you know, he lifts up the parable of the growing seed, where just that thing happens, you know, when the seed is planted and it grows, he knows not how. That there is a real value to that sort of untamed, you know, we can do so much, but then that mystery of the eschatological hope of the Messiah carries us forward to perceive the growth that will happen.
Thank you. Other thoughts? We've got almost 15 minutes to just have conversation now. Jean,
You're muted, Jean.
can you unmute yourself, Jean? There you go.
Yeah. There. Two thoughts.
All right.
One quick one. From the knitting community, the picture you showed us, I've seen recently describing a kind of knitting called intarsia that involves 5 or 6 strands at one time. And some knitters want to put it on different spindles and keep it organized. But another knitter who's pretty famous, Kay Fassett, has told us that a better way is to pull from the tangle. And I loved seeing the tangle as Jesus' life, and pulling from the tangle takes on a new meaning. The other
Thank you for that. Have you, before you get to your second point, I want to hear it, but long time ago, you're probably familiar with, there was an essay called Fluffing the Tangled Skein. Is skein a word with knitters?
Yes.
Skein?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Or
this person said that part of what we do with the Bible is fluff the tangled skein, that if you pull on it, it's just going to get tighter and harder. But what you do with the tangled skein is you fluff it, apparently. And I just love that analogy of taking the Bible and just, and it's a much, yeah, that's lovely. Thank you. Thank you.
The other piece, I just want to get out of the way. It's bothering me. Mark then was not the fellow that ran away naked.
Oh, that's in the Gospel of John, that story about a disciple running away naked.
Yeah.
We don't know. We just simply don't know. I don't know if that's one of the people who's speculated as quote, the author.
Okay.
There probably, truth be told, there probably was not one author. There was probably editors that became to be known as Mark, editors plural. But not just a random group of editors, because there's clearly design in the story. There's very sophisticated storytelling mechanisms with chiasms and all kinds of structure that poets admire and things like that. So it's not random, but I haven't heard that the famous streaker in the Gospel of John might be Mark. That was the other question?
Yeah.
Okay.
That one was not so theological. It was just bothering me. But I think it's such a relief to remember this time that Christmas never has been the easiest, happiest, most wonderful time of the year. So there's no reason it should be this year. I mean, in our nostalgia attempts, we can pretend that if only it would be wonderful, but last year was just as messy as the ones before. I mean, a little dicey to move around, and so Jesus comes anyway.
Yeah, that's the marketing that John is talking about. If we just buy something, if we just acquire one more thing, it'll make Christmas fall into place. Everything will be perfect for us, for our families, for those around us.
And I'm curious, what are the practices that each of y'all have through Advent, through Christmas, that help you stay grounded in that story that we as a community are rooted in, rather than getting sucked into what our society tells us? For me, that would be a very useful, interesting thing to get to hear about as I'm continuing to form my own practices and invite the youth to form theirs.
Great question. Thank you. Susan.
Sure. Well, I've followed for a long time. I've followed a Celtic tradition, which teaches you a lot about the earth and the world and how to deal with it. But the winter solstice comes after 2 harvest festivals. And we don't think of them here as harvest festivals because that's kind of over in August, but they go like through November, right? Almost up to Thanksgiving. Maybe not that late, but at least Halloween. And in that tradition, the month of December from I'm paraphrasing, it's not really true, but say from the time of Thanksgiving until Christmas is a time of darkness. And it is a time that you are supposed to be introspective, not introspection in opening your heart to what is outside. And they are awaiting at the time the child of light, and that is the winter solstice. And of course, it parallels Christianity. But I think it's a wonderful time to look because you're supposed to, everybody is afraid of the darkness. They hate the short days. And I happen to particularly love them because I like to watch the sunrise. And it doesn't bother me when it gets dark early. But in that darkness, all the mysteries are revealed. And that's the time you stop to think about all the many mysteries, like how the leaves are made and the change of the seasons, how it continues on. For all of these millennia, we've had the change of the seasons, unless you live in California. But those are the things that we should, I think, that keep you grounded in what is what.
Miranda?
Yeah.
And Susan, I thought that what you said was absolutely beautiful, just beautiful. I have to confess, I don't know that I'm that deep. And so I would struggle to be drawn into the marketing and such. But for me, Miranda, it's the music.
Yes.
And I love the traditions in the Episcopal Church. I didn't grow up in the Episcopal Church. So I love the traditions and the liturgy in the Episcopal Church because all of the music during the Advent season is centered on the coming of Jesus. O come, Emmanuel. So it's always the music for me that helps me to center.
And especially the first part of the Messiah that has, basically the prophecies, every valley shall be. In fact, didn't Kyle have that last year during Advent, the oratory about every valley shall be made smooth and the rough places are plain? I seem to remember a baritone singing.
No, it's a tenor.
Oh, who's a tenor? Okay, I'm sorry.
It's comfort you, my people.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Voice of him that crieth in the wilderness. That John, when you were mentioning that, the punctuation is not as you had suggested. So we'd have to think about that. I was really drawn to the whole notion that the wilderness, we read in most of the Gospels that before Jesus did anything significant in giving us the next thing to put into our ways of thinking, changing our ways of thinking, was preceded by a time in the wilderness. And we learn about temptation when Jesus was in the wilderness. We learn about his being ministered to by angels in the wilderness. So I think, I don't know, Miranda, it would be interesting to take Susan's idea of the earth and the dark times in the earth and get very clear about growth and planting of seeds. And there was a wonderful movie last night that we just happened, when you surf through, you're going to sit on the couch. You just don't know what you're going to do while you're there. And there happened to be this movie entitled Mary Magdalene. And the very opening of it is her spinning through what looked like an ocean. And the whole story is built around the seed that was planted when she heard about Jesus, and that nothing that she was doing was satisfying her, and she was searching and searching. And so much of the movie is going through these wilderness places. I recommend it. You need to watch it on a good day, because the crucifixion part, it's like in Mark's gospel, you get to it pretty quickly. But I just think we've learned a lot this morning about some really good things to think about.
In terms of music, and I guess where part of my idea comes from, I think of Omnium Mysterium and the Renaissance music that is not joyful. You know, we associate Christmas with joyful, but I like the mystery. You know, and that's what we were talking about today. So if you want to listen to some music that sort of might help you get into that, light a candle and put on some Palestrina. And
I'm curious, how many of you have Advent calendars in one way, shape, or form at home? Advent calendars. Are they traditional Advent calendars? There's been an explosion of creative Advent calendars, countdown to Christmas type Advent calendars that, oh, look at that. Oh, well, look at that. There's kudos to Miranda for that. Way to go, Daphne. I love the fact that Advent calendars have sort of taken off, and remarkably, they still call them Advent calendars. I'm surprised the culture hasn't renamed them countdown to Christmas calendars, but you hear the word Advent. Even the ones that have, you know, little treats in them for dogs and cats, or little miniatures of, you know, scotches, or the ones that have a little scene. I think the best ones have a character from a nativity set. One of them comes out every day, and you just keep building it. The reason I love Advent calendars is the way that they anticipate and build and count down, but it's not a binary switch. It's not like wait, boom, Christmas. There's a treat, a little treat every day as you, oh, look at that. That's an Advent. I'm going to put you on full screen here.
Advent wreath.
Advent wreath calendar.
Well, my husband is a biologist and a nature lover, so that was my gift. And we look at every little animal every day. And we've had very traditional ones as well, but this year we're doing nature and the owl.
Beautiful.
We sometimes can hear owls in our neighborhood, so it's very special.
Oh, wow.
An Advent calendar is a great gift for someone who has a long-term illness. Because when I was a child, I think probably in 3rd grade, I was in the hospital for months. And one of my friend's mothers made me an Advent calendar. And since my birthday was on the 4th, I got it for my birthday. And being so ill, opening that little door every day that is the best gift for anybody that is sick during this time.
Thanks.
John, when it comes to being in the wilderness, I am always reminded of when I was about 20 years old. As a product of North Carolina, I'd always been on the East Coast. I'd never been anywhere else. And I went out to Texas, out to El Paso, Texas, which is wilderness. There is not much out there, right? As far as, you know, the abundance of trees and shrubs and the smells of the East Coast. And I remember falling in love with the desert, because it, in a way where here my senses were filled always with an abundance of smell and sounds of nature. And I remember seeing things with new eyes, you know, every little, like a single flower was an amazement. The oils from the types of plants out there would just such a difference. And so when we think about wilderness and darkness, I think to see that abundance that is there, it's just putting on new eyes. You know, it's really attuning ourselves to, like you say, this mystery. What clue is there that God is, through the scripture, through life, what mystery is being revealed to us? And I think so, finding that time to slow down, Miranda, is the thing. I just put off. I don't decorate. I have my Advent calendar. Today I will put out St. Nick's around the house. Next week I will put up a tree with lights. And then on Christmas Eve, I decorate. And I make myself wait in anticipation. And then I'll tell you, I'd leave my tree up until, the end of February or something like that, because Christmas stays with me for a while longer than it does other people. But I think, just making yourself stop with the assault, turn off the TV, ignore the Christmas banter, and really sit. I plant things right now. I'm making new garden beds. I sit in that dark soil and wonder what growth will come from it next year.
Yeah, that's making me think of shortly, like my second, I guess, job out of college was in the desert doing conservation work. And I had never known what water smelled like before. And then when there's rain in the desert, or even there was a river running through the part of desert I was working in, and you could smell from like 100 feet away when you were coming back towards the river, because water smells like something in the desert.
Wow.
And just thinking about through the last few years when I've been working in the outdoors, working in more in areas that we would describe as wilderness, and working with people in the wilderness, and the transformation that makes possible for us as human beings through discomfort. Like, one of the most uncomfortable things that I would do with groups that would come in to visit the place that I worked last year was we'd do a night walk, and we'd go out into this pine forest in the pitch dark, and we would have no lights, like zero artificial light. And sometimes there was a full moon, sometimes there wasn't. And we'd walk in the darkness out into the woods, and then we'd walk individually in the darkness back from the woods. And it made a lot of folks really uncomfortable, and it made a lot of folks feel brave and curious, and like they could do so many other things, and opened up a ton of possibilities. And so, yeah, Julie and Susan and Mickey, like as you were talking about wilderness and darkness, that kind of reminded me of those experiences and those things that I've done with folks through the years.
Well, everyone, I'm aware of the time, partly because Kim just came in and asked questions about distribution of communion. So I'm going to pop out there and excuse myself, but so wonderful to see you all. Thank you for joining. Matthew, Mark, next week is Luke. And that's nice because Luke we'll return to some of those stories that are familiar to us in the Gospel of Luke. And so that'll be next week's forum, and it's a delight to see everyone. Let's close this with a prayer. Mickey, you were very close to closing us with a prayer there with what you were saying. Do you want to close us with a prayer, please?
Okay. God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the abundance of life around us, waiting to turn towards you. Guide us during this Advent. Let us look at the things that are dark in ourselves, not be afraid to see you shining through them. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Happy Advent.
Bye, Emma.